Can I get a mic or a mic and a half? That the source owe me. Shout out to the editor staff. Yeah, I'm all grown, so much better with math. I need a spread in the Forbes, taking the Benjamin bath. Yeah, I'm serving this track like Steffi Graf. Yeah, Roger Federer, there's no competitor.
Urban Tennis, episode 21. Never give up. Welcome back, everyone, to the Urban Tennis Podcast. I'm your host, joined by my co-host.
How do you do?
Pretty good. We're joining you today just as Indian Wells has wrapped up. We know that Flavia Pennetta and Novak Djokovic have claimed the singles titles, so we're going to be talking about their victories. We're also going to be talking about the more significant stories on either side of the draw. We'll be looking and talking about Indian Wells in general. This year, they've once again expanded their site and have really transformed into a premier tennis facility. And finally, our media segment, which we'll look at 3D, which was introduced this week in Indian Wells. So if you're ready, this is this episode of Urban Tennis. Just joining us today, Sunday night, we've just seen Novak Djokovic beat Roger Federer in a third set tiebreak in a match that I don't think was either men's best tennis, but was one that both had their kind of ups and downs in. Federer had a fantastic start and really manage the match as best you can. I know it ended up being nearly 2 hours, but he was ending points fairly quickly. His serve was very consistent. Djokovic once again looked fairly shaky, and it's difficult to say that you can be so shaky yet still win a title of this magnitude, but that was Novak Djokovic's week this week. So I'm going to bring in my co-host now. You saw this 3-set tiebreak, maybe some initial impressions, and were you more occupied when you were watching this in maybe Federer, where he's kind of returned to, the level he's returned to, or maybe the shakiness in the key moments by Djokovic?
I think I'll go with... What I saw from the match was Federer, and it seemed like a return to form. I'm sure that's been covered before. I mean, he did go to the semifinals in Australia, but I think it shows that he
won Dubai.
Yeah, he won Dubai. Yeah. So the point is, this is a kind of North American introduction to the return of Federer. And I think he hasn't faced Novak this year, right? So
no, he did. He beat Novak in the semis of Dubai.
Oh, okay. So shows how much I remember of Tom Ed. It's late here, ladies and gentlemen. It's late. West Coast tennis, not used to it.
Yeah, but I think what Federer has done definitely in this 3-month period is shown that he's not the same player he was when he had those back issues last year. He's more of the player we've known before that, obviously. But one thing I found in Federer's game today was that he wasn't especially... never went for something out of his routine. He seemed to play a game within himself. And I guess that's the positive here. Many times in the recent iterations of Federer and Nadal, you seem like Federer kind of loses it within the first couple of games, But this time he kept to his game plan. That great break at 5-4 in the third set was just perfect. And it was just a vintage Federer game where he can just capitalize on that one game and quickly turn a set or quickly finish a set. But more about Djokovic. He had trouble serving it out against Isner, and that match got extended to 3. He had trouble once again in this match. It's kind of following the narrative where Novak Djokovic, he's only won one Grand Slam now in the last 2 years, and he's had tough times closing out big matches. So is there cause for concern with Novak Djokovic's ability to close out big matches?
I'm going to say no, because it's pretty clear that he's probably right now playing among the best tennis this year of any player on the tour. But then he's playing one of the best, but he's not at the levels that were we just kind of
he's not at the 2011 level. Is that what we're comparing him to still?
I think it is, and I think that's you don't need to compare him to that. You don't need to compare him to that level anymore because it's not like it was in 2011 where you had Federer, Murray, and Nadal all nipping at your toes, and Novak was able to separate himself with that streak. I think at this point, he's able to just.
But were you happy with his service game today? I don't think you can be. He got away with it, but you can't give guys like Isner and Federer chances. It's not going to pay off in a 5-set match, especially.
Yeah, you have a point there, but I think we have talked about it before a little bit off air. This is the year of transition. I think there's been articles written about that, and it's starting to look like that. So, yes, it looks like Novak, if he does play like 2011 Novak, he should be able to run away with this year because it seems like the competition isn't like it was that year.
Let's talk about your point about the year of transition. This tournament alone, we had Nadal and Murray go out pretty early. Del Potro was basically a scratch for his wrist injury, no Federer. But we had big tournaments from guys like Alexander Dolgopolov, Ernest Gulbis, John Isner. What do you think of the year? First, kind of tell everybody what you think the year of transition means or what people have written about it. And specifically talk about maybe one of these guys who had a good week this week and why that was possible.
Well, I think year of transition for me means that you're not going to see the dominance this year. I think every year since about like 2006, I think, longer than that, sorry, 2004, there's only been like one or two tournaments that haven't been won by one of Nadal, Federer, or Djokovic, and I'm talking about Grand Slams. So that means when you get to Grand Slams, most notably like when you get to like Wimbledon, U.S. Open, it means anybody in the playing field, and it doesn't just necessarily mean young players, but it means young players can start establishing their footing better. Like we had like a player like Milos Raonic has had trouble proceeding past the quarterfinals, but I think in a year like this, where from what we've seen so far, he'll be able to maybe break into semifinals and maybe I don't want to get ahead of myself. Maybe get into a final.
Yeah, I think that's key. I don't think we're still at a point where you can say that any of these second tier guys are have the Grand Slam capability, but I do think that they're going to start going into final eights, final fours, and in many ways that is what transition means. They're on the doorstep now. Now, will any of these guys win one this year? I still don't think so. I still think when you put it down to it, a Wimbledon and a U.S. Open title will probably go to one of those big four, but they're putting themselves in position, and you kind of see maybe 2015 and beyond that eventually, like Stan Wawrinka this year, that one of them will get it. Let's talk about Flavia Pennetta and the women's draw.
Yeah, we were talking about the year of transition for men. Indian Wells is always like a transitional tournament. It has been for like quite a while, with the Williams sisters always withdrawing for, of course, their boycott. But let's talk about tennis. I mean, I think even if one of the Williams sisters, even if Serena was playing, I think Flavia Pennetta's performance would still stand out.
Yeah, it's one of those titles, obviously Flavia's biggest of her career, that you can't take it away from her. I'm just looking down at the people she beat: Sloane Stephens, Li Na, Radwanska, even if she was kind of hurting in the finals, Camila Giorgi, who else? Taylor Townsend. These are big wins by Flavia Pennetta, and it's not like somebody who's, just not riding momentum. She's had a fantastic 12 months also. Her semifinal result in the U.S. Open wasn't a fluke. This result's not a fluke. In many ways, I always say Indian Wells, especially because of the Williams boycott, is one of the most exciting women's tournaments of the year. And I think this year proved it again. Tons of upsets, tons of potential looks by players who are obviously playing well. I think we'll talk about Simona Halep a bit later. But Flavia Pennetta, I think, deserved her victory this week.
Well, what do you think about Radwanska? So this is a tournament that we have in Indian Wells, and it leads next week right into the Sony Open in Miami. Do you think there's any cause of concern for her future trajectory now?
Yeah, as we're taping this, we haven't heard if she's withdrawn. She's going to be the number 3 seed in Sony, has a fairly good draw. But if she doesn't play, I'm not too concerned about the injury, but it's going to be, obviously, if she misses out on the chance to, go deep in Sony, that could potentially affect her ranking points. But, beyond the injury, Agnieszka Radwanska may be one of the more tortured players we've seen in recent memory. It just seems whenever she puts herself in position or becomes a favorite in one of these big tournaments, something wrong happens. Either she loses or she gets hurt. And we saw it in Melbourne this year when she got, blitzed by Sibylkova. Last year, Wimbledon, her losing to Lizicki. Today, big favorite against Pennetta, at least ranking-wise, doesn't get it done. It seems like she's just a tortured player in the sense that she's good enough to get there, but in many ways, she'll never be what we consider a great champion of our time.
Yeah, I tend to agree. You want to talk about Simona Halep's tournament? I think that's definitely what we're talking about.
Yeah, Simona Halep is quietly, I guess, like Pennetta now. She's now going to be, as of Monday, a top 5 player in the world. And that's saying something. She was ranked in the 60s heading into Rome last year. So that's just a meteoric rise. I think she's won more than 5 tournaments. I think it's more than anybody other than Serena in the last 12 months. She's done it, and she's become basically the gold standard of women's tennis for Romania. So that's saying something. We always like to say that tennis is a global sport that can be carried and influenced by one athlete making it in that country, similar to what Serbia did. So Romania's had a good legacy of men's players in the 70s, but seeing a women's player do this well, it can only benefit Romanian tennis potentially in the years forward.
Yeah, it's a little bit under the radar. I think it's kind of like you had the Lakers dynasty in the NBA, and then you had like the Spurs dynasty, which a lot of people may not recognize. But say like Novak, he had like the Lakers dynasty, and then Simona Halep's her start this year is very strong and very similar to Novak's start. It just may not be as impactful in some people's minds, but obviously it deserves some recognition.
I think the question with Simona is always, can she do it in a slam? What are your feelings? You saw her play a couple times in the Indian Wells. Do you think she has the potential to be around deep in a slam?
Yeah, I think she does. I think her biggest asset is her mental game. I think she's shown that this year that she doesn't shy away when things get tough. She does when the pressure's on her. She has stepped up and she has won. Obviously, she's won a lot this year. So I think that alone could be enough to help push her into probably a semi, maybe a final, into a Grand Slam.
That's a fair point. You really, you can teach the mental game, but until somebody executes it well, you never know. A lot of talk, obviously, is about Indian Wells because seemingly every year something is bigger, something is better. And this year they introduced their Stadium 2 court, constructed within a year, a beautiful 8,000-seat facility, has an on-site Nobu, a steakhouse.
I think you have to explain what Nobu is first.
A Nobu is a Japanese Peruvian restaurant by famous restaurateur. Nobu, funded by Robert De Niro, so it's a very high class facility with high class restaurant potential. And it got interesting where a lot of people have seen the renovations now. This year, over 400,000 spectators came to Indian Wells. And an interesting question was posed. I read it on John Wertheim's Sports Illustrated Tennis mailbag, where would the U.S. Open ever consider bringing the U.S. Open to Indian Wells, especially after Larry Ellison has basically made this tournament in the last 5 to 10 years, not even arguably anymore. I think it's probably the 4th greatest venue in tennis, and that's above Roland Garros.
I'm going to say no. It does fill out a lot of the check marks. It's clear that they would be able to sell out the facilities. It's clear that they'd be able to charge a lot more than they even charge for Indian Wells and make a significant amount of revenue. The biggest problem is that Indian Wells is very far from a major city. It's a 2-hour drive away from Los Angeles, and there's like no major transit links. So while that doesn't mean that, yes, people are attending attendance, they're obviously excited for it, right? But when you have a US Open and you're going to move it around, you want to actually get a benefit from the US Open. So even if so for example, the US Open being in New York, it takes over the city for that time. When you have a US Open in Indian Wells, it'd be difficult to replicate that in the Los Angeles area because it is more isolated from that area. So I don't know, the USTA would get the benefit of creating more excitement in a different part of the country when a lot of the people in that region would not be able to access that tournament.
Yeah, and I think you can't compare it to the golf model. Tennis, obviously, I think more so the Aussie Open has jumped around. But even then, when it jumped, those were permanent sites. When they hosted in Sydney for those many years, that was a permanent site there. Where I can see it, potentially one of the things was that once every 5 years. But I agree with my co-host. You're too far away from a metro area. You know, sure, players would love staying in a resort town, but then you're not going to go beyond maybe the people who can afford to live in that resort. You know, one of the beauties of the U.S. Open is you can take the subway, you can take the 7. You can be somebody who doesn't have a lot of money, but, you know, is saved all year long to go to, you know, a quarterfinal match at Arthur Ashe Stadium. So you can't do that in Indian Wells. And
plus, Arthur Ashe Kids Day is free, so that means that
they have free activities. Yeah. The first weekend is free. I don't think that's an issue.
Yeah, but then look at it that way too. You're in the New York area. You can take the subway, and you can get kids into tennis at a low cost. Like your transportation doesn't cost anything, and the tennis is still free too.
What about my alternative theory? You know, the World Tour Finals, the ATP World Tour Finals, it was always a moving kind of circus, but now it's kind of situated in London. Shouldn't the ATP think of coming to Indian Wells in November? I think the weather will be still great. It'll prove that if you build it, we'll come back 2 times in a year. I think it's just a positive reinforcement by the tour that, hey, Indian Wells, we see what you're doing, and we respect that.
I absolutely agree with that. I think I would like to see the World Tour Final move around, but to play the devil's advocate on that point, it's really when the ATP World Tour Final was in the O2 that it really took off into the global event we have right now. So I think they're going to stay on the O2 for quite some time. And moving on, we're going to talk in our media and technology segment about the new broadcast innovation of 3D. For those of you unfamiliar, 3D is a new innovation that was introduced at this year's Indian Wells Masters, where after a shot, it will give you an instant replay, and it will give you at a 360-degree angle. So that will give you a better idea of what type of angle and what type of shots that, for example, Roger Federer just hit right there. Like, okay, that looked like a great shot. Let's see what it looked like from this angle.
I think it's a great innovation, you know, just the fact that you can see a Roger Federer one-hand backhand, but we can see what's going through Roger Federer's head. You can kind of go behind him, see where the other player's on the court, see what he sees, and then kind of once again turn it again to isolate where he's hitting it from. You know, is it at his shoulders? Is it at his head? Is it at his waist? You know, they often say, I read about this technology in an article on Slate, and I think we'll link to that article, that tennis, you know, is just kind of catching up with other sports in their, you know, television design. You know, for many years, tennis coverage has worked where you just place a camera behind the players and you can see them both on screen at once. What this adds is that 360 angle of, you know, of a live tennis event. You know, when you see anything live, when you see NBA live, when you see tennis live, it's about spacing, and sometimes you can't capture all that on TV. So a replay like this can show where the two players are in comparison to each other and see then what kind of shot and where that shot was being hit. So I think it's a great thing, and it looked awesome. While I was streaming it on Tennis TV, it looked awesome.
Yeah, nothing more I can add to that. I definitely, anything that can make the players look more impressive and more athletic than they are is better in my books.
So just when you're watching next time, see if they use 3D, and if you like it, obviously let us know. We're almost nearing the end of this edition of the Urban Tennis Podcast, but like always, we like to end with certain games, and we will do a game of challenges because If one Master Series event is done, another is on tap, and that's Miami. So we won't have a Miami preview show, but we'll have a recap show. So we're just going to do some challenges that will take the place of our preview show. So I'm going to bring in my co-host with his first challenge for Miami.
My first challenge goes out to John Isner. John Isner had a really good Indian Wells tournament where he went to the semifinals. I want to see him capture this momentum and do it in the South. Like we all remember his tweet from the U.S. Open, the South is God's country according to him. So I want to see him actually utilize this crowd and carry that momentum into Miami.
My second challenge is for Maria Sharapova. Obviously, she has shoulder concerns. She had that stint in Sochi, but once again, last year she did really well in Indian Wells in Miami. Winner in Indian Wells, finalist in Miami. She didn't do as well in Indian Wells this year. A lot of ranking points up for grab in Miami. I want to see two things. I want to see if she's healthy enough to play in these back-to-back weeks, and also if she's back to her gaming situation where she can grind out those victories and find a way. And she's in the top half of the draw, so possibly a Serena Williams semi-final matchup, which is not ideal for her. But I want to see her get to that point and defend those points like she can.
All right. And my final challenge goes out to the title sponsor, Sony. Sony, I want you to do for tennis what you did for Major League Baseball. I want you to make a really good next generation tennis video game. All right. And I think the Sony Open is a good way to start planting those seeds. And by next year, I want to see a good movement and development. I want tennis for PS4.
It's always about the video games. Okay. Our social media highlight of the week comes from today's women's final, and our co-host is going to talk about it.
All right. This is from the Tennis TV Twitter account, and champagne moment, kind of. Fognini pelted Flavia Pennetta with water after the win. #tennis, #BNP14. And so it just shows a really good camaraderie that Pennetta has with the other players on both tours, actually. So I think it was a really nice moment for Pennetta.
Absolutely. Pennetta, very well liked. And as we're wrapping today, you can obviously listen to this podcast and other podcasts on SoundCloud, at Urban Tennis Network, on YouTube. Find us at Urban Tennis. And our title this week comes from something Pennetta wrote on her camera after winning. In Italian, she wrote, "Never give up." So as one of our favorite wrestlers, at least if you're an 8-year-old boy, would say, never give up. Urban Tennis, episode 21.
Your time is up, my time is now. You can't see me, my time is now. It's the franchise where I'm shining now. You can't see me, my time is now. In case you forgot or fell off, I'm still hot, knock your shell off. My money stacked fat, plus I can't turn the swell off. The franchise doing big business, I live this, it's automatic. I win this, so you hear those horns, you finish.